Hi, it's Anna. Welcome back to Books on the Go. I heard the news recently that David Lynch had died, which is sad news. He was 78, which does feel too young, too soon, but he had the most incredible career, and I have always really loved, especially Twin Peaks, but some of his other movies as well, Mulholland Drive, Blue Velvet. There are one or two that I haven't seen, but I really love his work. And one of the things I've always found interesting with him, and also some authors that I love, is trying to think of reader likes. So if you like his work, what books might you enjoy that can give you the same feels? And of course, with some of the best artists and writers, it's really hard to find that because they're quite singular and they're originals, and that's why we're drawn to them. But I thought I'd give this a go. So with David Lynch, and thinking particularly of Twin Peaks, but also some of those other movies, I thought I'd recommend some books to read if you are a fan of David Lynch. So Lynch-esque in some way. And just to kick off with, I do have this Room to Dream, which is by David Lynch and Kristine McKenna. So this is interweaving each of them talking about different stages of his career. So Kristine McKenna will give you a factual rundown or tell you the story of how this movie came to be made or how Twin Peaks got started and things like that. And then after her section, David Lynch writes about it, and his memory sometimes isn't the same, but he's more anecdotal. So he'll just say, I remember this particular moment, or I remember how this scene came to be, or how I came to cast this person. So it's really interesting, and if you're a fan, I think definitely worth a read. It's very easy reading. There's a review that I've actually kept, and I've kept it at the back of the book, where they say it's interesting, it still keeps a mystery surrounding him, and he really liked mystery. He didn't like answers or explanations so much as leaving things for the viewer to interpret and to form their own version or their own view of what the story was. So and this is consistent with that in the sense that we don't find out much more about him, but it's a bit of a deep dive into his work, which is really fun. So that's Room to Dream. And so I was thinking, because you can't ever find a book that's exactly like a TV show or a film. Each work has its own DNA, and you don't want a complete copy. You don't want something that's just derivative. But I was trying to think of books that share some elements of what I love about his work. So thinking back to Twin Peaks, one of the things I loved about it was it moves between the real and the slightly dreamy or the surreal, but is very grounded in reality. So you don't feel like you're going into some sort of science fiction world or some fantasy world. You're still grounded in this small town. I think it was filmed around Vancouver or that part of Canada, but the small town of Twin Peaks, and it's beautiful setting, of course, so the setting is a huge character in that show, but it's really a murder mystery. We have the death of Laura Palmer and the characters all around her coming to terms with her death and trying to solve the mystery. And then Agent Dale Cooper comes into town from the FBI, and he's in charge of the case, and he's just a great character, and he stops in at the diners and he's eating cherry pie and he's having coffee and saying this is really, damn fine coffee. He goes to the police station, so you have your local police and the sheriff, Andy, and so very grounded and very day-to-day in that sense, the high school that Laura had been at and her friends. And then it ventures into more dreamscapes as well at various points. But that, as someone who doesn't really enjoy fantasy and science fiction, I quite enjoyed that because it was grounded in that small town life, which was very realistic, and characters were all very real, but eccentric. And that's another thing that I think really appealed to me about the show and really resonated and made it so memorable, was you had the log lady and you had Audrey dancing all by herself in the diner, and all sorts of really interesting characters. And so I was trying to pick out elements of his work that you could find in books, but you won't find all of it in one book, I don't think. But Bluebird, Bluebird by Attica Locke, this is a thriller, and it's also quite literary and a commentary about being a black man in a small town in Texas. And the ranger is, I think it's Darren Matthews is a black Texas ranger, and he goes to this small town where he has to investigate 2 deaths. And so you get, through his eyes, a real commentary on race issues in small town America, and particularly that part of the world. But it's also a really good thriller. But the reason I picked this as a reader, like if you're into David Lynch's work, and particularly Twin Peaks, is that small town feel and the characters you meet in I think there's a Geneva who runs a cafe in the middle of nowhere on this highway, and he spends a bit of time in there, and he's navigating this very interesting local community, but through meeting her and meeting some of the characters and having those elements of a typical American small town, I thought that's a bit similar to the Twin Peaks setup, where you've got, on the face of it, a murder mystery or a thriller or a police procedural almost, but then there are so many other elements layered into it, but it's grounded in that suspenseful, page-turning thriller. So I really loved this. There's a second one, is Heaven My Home, I think, and I believe there's a third one coming, or it might have even been published, but let me know if you've read those books. And if you know any more about the third one, that's Bluebird, Bluebird by Attica Locke. And then, still working with eccentric characters and quite singular characters, Vernon SUBUTEX by Virginie Despentes, and this is in French, translated by Frank Wynne. And again, it's, on the face of it, nothing like Twin Peaks or David Lynch's films, but it's set in Paris. What I really like about this is I think if David Lynch was a punk feminist French woman, perhaps this would be the sort of thing he might have written. Vernon SUBUTEX was a proprietor of a record store, and he's down and out. So the record store's going or has gone out of business. His rent is due. He can't afford to pay rent. He can't even get the unemployment benefits. He's out on the streets in Paris. But he has this recording of Alex Bleach, who was a famous musician and a patron of Vernon SUBUTEX, who's just died, and it's the last known recording of him. So it's worth a lot of money. So he's got that, and that's his ticket, or that's his insurance, I suppose. But a lot of other people want to get their hands on it. So there's a chase for this tape that he has, and he's also trying to get his head above water. And so he's mixing with a very grungy underbelly of Paris, and then he's got people chasing him, and it's infused with music because that's part of his character, of course, being a music shop owner. And it's unapologetic in giving you characters who are not pretty. They're not necessarily pretty or well behaved, but they feel very real, and characters who you don't always see in fiction. So I find that sort of a similar vibe in a way to some of David Lynch's work, and also just really fun, and again just very page-turnery and engaging and beautifully written. So that is Vernon SUBUTEX. Now, looking at this line that David Lynch walks between the real and the surreal, I think this does it beautifully. Ella Baxter, Woo Woo, which I've spoken about before. We've done it, I think, on the podcast. Sabine, the main character of this, is an artist, and she's eccentric, as some artists are, and she's being stalked. So you have this very interesting mix of her. She's about to open an exhibition. She's under a lot of stress, and then she has a stalker. So you've got this real suspense and tension because of that element. But then she's not getting any sleep, so she becomes quite delirious. So it really merges into a nightmarish. It has that nightmarish quality, or that fever dream quality, where the day-to-day events then start to blur into the is this real or is this not real? Is this a bad dream sort of side of it? But then it's grounded in the fact that she is at home preparing for this exhibition. She's online, so you have her comments on her YouTube channel. She's posting things. She's trying to avoid the stalker. So it's still very grounded. And I think Ella Baxter walks that line really masterfully, and it's really well controlled. But you have the eccentricity of the artist fully expressing herself with no holds barred. I think that's another element of David Lynch. He really allows his characters to be completely themselves, and it's not too neat and tidy. And this really captures that, but also it doesn't become so unhinged that it takes you out of the story. So that's I think a tricky line to walk, and Ella Baxter does it really well. Another one who does this really well and that almost bamboozled me, and perhaps did bamboozle me, is Untold Night and Day by Bae Suah. And this is a Korean novelist, and this book is translated by Deborah Smith, who of course has translated the work of Han Kang, who recently won the Nobel Prize. And Deborah Smith is such a clean and beautiful translator. This book is about, this has the eccentricity and the is it real or is it not real? We're walking a very fine tightrope quality of David Lynch's work, and it's about 28-year-old Kim Ayami, who's worked at Seoul's only audio theatre for the blind, but the theatre's shutting down. She then goes for a walk at night time with her boss, or her former boss, and they're looking for a friend who has disappeared. Then she becomes a guide for a detective novelist who's visiting from abroad. And then it's the height of summer, order gives way to chaos, the edges of reality start to fray, and the past intrudes on the present and becomes disruptive. I can't remember much more in terms of what happens, and I think I didn't quite know what happened. But all I will tell you is that Daisy Johnson has called it, she said, I loved this book, I loved its uncanny beauty, its startling occurrences. As it unravels, you feel, if only a little, yourself unraveling too, a Lynchian triumph. So it has been, and I remember reading it thinking that was quite an apt comparison. So it's really crystal clear, masterfully written, and it draws you in. I remember thinking, I don't quite follow what's happening, but I can't stop reading because it's just so well told, and I need to know what happens with this character, and I'm still not sure that I do know, but I really recommend it. If you are a David Lynch fan, I think you have to read Untold Night and Day by Bae Suah, and then tell me what you think was happening. And the other one, and I think a lot of people have compared this author to David Lynch, and that's Haruki Murakami. And in particular, the book that's often cited is the Wind-Up Bird Chronicle, which I absolutely loved. And this one was translated from the Japanese by Rubin. And this has a lot of the motifs which become recurring motifs in Murakami's work. And that's another thing that you find with David Lynch, is these motifs, these things that keep appearing, like the owls or the red curtain or whatever it might be. I can't remember now what some of them were, but things that pop up and that help build that connection between the viewer and the work. And with Haruki Murakami, this one has them all. So Toru Okada's cat has disappeared, so cat's immediately in the picture, and it's unsettled his wife, who's becoming distant, and then he's getting phone calls that he starts receiving, and he goes on a journey. It disrupts his life. So he spends his life cooking, reading, listening to jazz and opera, and drinking beer at the kitchen table. So that's another recurring thing we see in Murakami's work, is often a single man. In this case, he's married, but they're often cooking at home in their apartment, and they're listening to there's always music, and we know Haruki Murakami used to run a jazz bar in Tokyo, so there's a lot of music in his work, which is another strong feature of Twin Peaks. The incredible music by, was it Angelo Badalamenti? I can't remember his name, isn't that terrible? But it was such haunting music in Twin Peaks. So a lot of music in this one, and then the cats and then the journey. So in this journey, he then meets other people who tell him their stories, and including, I remember there was an army person who was telling him all about what happened in World War II between China and Japan. So there's a lot in this book, but also he goes down a well at one point, and a well is such a feature of Murakami's work. And in fact, he has talked about his writing process as he feels as if he is going down into a well, and he writes when he goes into the flow state. Perhaps he's writing, and then he emerges from the well into the real world. So he has that way of describing his work, but there are actual wells in his books as well, so to speak. And I noticed in Room to Dream, when David Lynch is talking about his process, the title is a reference to him saying he has to have a room almost that he goes into where he's in touch with his dream state or his subconscious or his imagination, and then he produces the work. And it's where his experience, I think he says his life experience, can re-emerge as art, and he needs to go into, he calls it a room to do that. And I don't know if he means an actual room or a room in his mind, but I just thought that was interesting. They both have similar ways of talking about their work. So Haruki Murakami, I do have his latest novel, The City and Its Uncertain Walls. He's another author who merges that real and the surreal, because his works they do go into a surreal. You have talking animals and things like that. And I've always managed to navigate that and still feel grounded in his work. But this one might test me, because I've just read the blurb, and it's a young couple, and then the girl tells the boy about a mysterious town, and it's capital T town, which immediately raises a flag, doesn't it, that this could be surreal. Surrounded by a high wall, in that town, her real self resides. So if the boy can come with her, he'll find his own place. He could be a dream reader, capital D, capital R, dream reader. So that has fantasy elements that are worrying me. Reading old dreams, he's not sure whether to believe her, but then she disappears. So he then goes on this quest for his lost love, on a journey between the real world and this other world, a town where unicorns roam. So I'm getting quite worried that this is going to test me in terms of keeping it real. But The City and Its Uncertain Walls is my next Murakami. So I don't know, let me know if you've read that and if you think it's a good comparison with David Lynch. That they are some Lynchian bookish recommendations from me, but I'd love to know if you have enjoyed David Lynch's work, and if you have reader likes as well, what those might be. So let me know in the comments, and I will see you soon. Bye for now.